Hey there, folks. Welcome back to CRYPTID'S Den. I hope your day's treating you well. I'm diving straight into the story today because, well, at least by my standards, so no small talk this time around. Today's tale takes us to a mysterious lake somewhere in northern Manitoba. Just a heads up, the beginning comes with quite a few details before things really pick up, but I promise they add depth and texture to the story, so I've kept them in. Now, let's get into it. It was years later, but the door never creaked the same after that night. Bill Simmons would always remember that first summer back at the cabin. Not for the fishing or the campfires, but for the silence that followed the sound of that door handle shaking in the dark. That was the moment something ancient re-entered his family's life. But back then, Bill didn't know any of that. Not yet. Before the forest whispered its name again, before the shadows at the edge of the trees returned, there was just memory. And the first memory, his truest one, was his grandfather's laugh echoing across the lake. Bernard Simmons, or Buddy as everyone called him, wasn't always a recluse. Once, he was a man of the world, flying in seaplanes with his best friend Benjamin Carter. Ben, the wild-eyed pilot, with a voice like gravel and stories thicker than the forest mist. In the 1970s, when men still chased silence like it was something holy, Buddy asked Ben to drop him off at a remote lake in the northern wilds. Alone. No map. No plan. Just a rifle. Some cans of food, and the clothes on his back. Ben had argued, of course. Said it wasn't safe. Said winter could kill faster than any bear. But Buddy only nodded and promised to be back. Eventually. He wasn't. Not for 3 years. What happened during those missing years was never fully explained. Not to his sister. Not to his son, Daniel. Buddy returned with a beard down to his chest, skin like leather, and eyes that looked through people. But he came back, built a life, reconnected with his boy, and every month, he and Daniel would fly up to the cabin and construct it from nothing. A one-room lodge with hand-sawn logs and a porch facing the lake, like it was watching for something. When Daniel became a father himself, that torch passed again. The cabin for Bill was the cradle of summers, the backdrop to fireflies, splashing feet, and the smell of pine mixed with smoked fish. There were no neighbors, no roads, no power, just water, trees, and something else. Something watching. Bill didn't know back then that his grandfather had seen things in the woods, that he believed a nurse back to life by something not entirely human. He only knew that Buddy treated the woods like a church and always watched the tree line after dark. And sometimes he'd say odd things. Some folks live beneath the wind, Buddy once told him, squinting into the trees. You just can't always see him. At 8, Bill thought it was just another campfire story. Until Buddy died. It happened suddenly. A heart attack, they said. He never got to retire at the cabin like he dreamed. And after that, Daniel stopped going up. The man who once flew through storms for just one more weekend in the woods now avoided the place like it was cursed. Bill would beg him, plead for one more summer. But Daniel only shook his head and said, I'm too tired, kid. Eventually, Bill convinced him to fly up just once more. They landed, unloaded, and Daniel took one long look at the cabin, now fitted with a tiny fridge, a generator, and a VCR TV Buddy had installed before his death. Daniel asked who was all this for, and Buddy, in his final summer, had only smiled and said, the kids like it. When Daniel pressed, what kids? Buddy just laughed. I meant Ben, he muttered. But his eyes didn't smile. There was something hollow in Daniel after that visit, something that made him avoid the cabin altogether. So when Bill started flying solo with his best friend Dave, it was like retaking a family kingdom. 2 young men in the wilderness, fishing, building, reclaiming the silence. But some silences should stay buried. One summer, something changed. The woods weren't the same anymore. There were sounds. Strange sounds. Stones tapping, cones thrown, shadows moving like they didn't belong. And then a smell, worse, Something animal, wet and old. It seeped into the floorboards, into the air, into them. One night, Dave woke Bill up panicked. "There's something under the cabin," he whispered. Bill laughed, half asleep. "A possum or something?" "No," Dave hissed. "It's big. It's making the floor bounce." And it was. When they stepped, the wood flexed beneath their feet like something was pressing up from below. Then came the sounds. Grinding teeth, low growls, breath that felt too close. They grabbed flashlights and rifles, heartbeats hammering, and crawled beneath the cabin the next morning. What they found was not a den. It was a nest. Bones, raccoon skulls, half-eaten possums, piles of them, mixed with tufts of coarse black hair and claw marks on the joists. Something lived there. Something that hadn't been invited. They burned it all, piled the remains out on a tarp, and dumped them deep in the forest. Then they bathed in the lake like they could scrub fear off their skin. They tried to forget. Tried to enjoy the rest of summer. But the woods weren't done. Bill began reading his grandfather's papers. Pages Buddy had stashed in a drawer Bill had never opened before. And what he found changed everything. Sketches, names, descriptions, notes, a family of them. Not human, something in between. Buddy had known them, trusted them. He called them his second family. But there, halfway through the journal, one sentence made Bill stop breathing. "The boy. He doesn't like my grandson." Bill dropped the paper. There had been children, if you could call them that. A family Buddy believed saved him when he was lost. They fed him roots, berries, let him sit by their fire. But one of them, the older boy, grew jealous, violent, and Buddy had to banish him from the cabin. The boy didn't forget. He never left. He had stayed, watching, waiting. And maybe, just maybe, he remembered Bill. The nights grew louder. The smell returned. And then came the night the door handle rattled again. But this time, Bill wasn't a child. And the cabin wasn't empty. He would learn the truth, page by page, scream by scream, until the silence he inherited finally spoke. Because some legacies don't live in names or bloodlines. They live in the woods. And the woods never forget. The first time Bill Simmons returned to the cabin after his grandfather's death, the lake was unusually still, like the water itself was listening. There were no ripples, no birds calling from the pines, just the low hum of the floatplane engine cutting out. And then, silence. Daniel Simmons, his father, had dropped them off with a brief nod and an even briefer goodbye, like he couldn't stand to be near the place for more than a few minutes. Bill didn't press him. Not yet. He just grabbed his gear, stepped onto the creaking dock, and let the quiet soak into his skin. By then, Bill had begun to understand that silence wasn't just an absence. It had weight, shape, intention, especially out there. The wilderness didn't just stretch for miles, it swallowed. There were no cell signals, no emergency routes, and no reason for anyone else to be within 50 miles. Just the cabin, the woods, and the lake, and whatever still moved beneath the trees. At first, things felt ordinary, almost comforting. Bill and Dave unpacked, checked the generator, fished off the dock, but there was a tension in the air. Something you didn't notice until the sun dipped and the wind died. That first night, while Bill stood outside brushing his teeth, he realized the trees went swaying. They went even whispering. The forest was holding its breath. By the third day, the signs started. First, it was the stones. They came out of nowhere. Small, hard pebbles that struck the side of the cabin or rustled the underbrush near the outhouse. Then came the pine cones. One landed directly on Dave's hat and rolled off without a sound. They laughed, chalked it up to squirrels. But both of them had grown up in the woods. Squirrels didn't aim. Then came the smell. It crept in slow, like rot born of wet fur and old earth. It filled the cabin, clung to their clothes, settled into their lungs. They searched for the source, dead animal, spoiled food, anything. But there was nothing. The cabin was dry, clean, sealed. That night Bill dreamed of someone standing over his bed. Not looking at him, just watching. He could hear breath, long and measured, like it was counting the seconds between moments. When he woke, his sheets were damp with sweat, and Dave was already dressed, standing by the door with the rifle in his hands. "There's something under the cabin," he said. Bill blinked. "Still half in the dream." "What do you mean?" "I mean I heard it. Clawing. Scratching. Pushing up on the floorboards." They waited until daylight to check. Crawling under the cabin felt like slipping into a grave. Cold air clung to the soil. The light barely reached, but the moment they got under, they saw the bones. Scattered. Broken. Chewed. Raccoons. Possums. Some small deer. Flies buzzed thick in the corners. But it wasn't just the bones. It was the way they were stacked. Like something had been nesting down there. Something that didn't want to be seen. Bill felt a chill slip down his back, like cold fingers dragging across his spine. They pulled the tarp from the shed, loaded the remains, and dragged them deep into the woods, far from the cabin. No words. Just the sound of boots on pine needles and the drag of bone on vinyl. That night, they didn't light a fire. They locked the door. Slept with the rifles nearby. A few minutes after midnight, the generator shut off. Neither of them moved. Then came the knock. Not on the door, from beneath. Like a fist, soft and wet, tapping at the floor. They held their breath, counted heartbeats, waited for it to end, but it didn't. The tapping moved across the floor, following the creak of their weight above. Dave aimed his rifle at the floorboards. Bill did the same, and then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The next morning, the smell was back. Stronger. Sickening. Bill checked the kitchen drawer again. Inside, behind the old manuals and appliance receipts, was a stack of papers. Yellowed, curled at the edges, but still intact. His grandfather's handwriting. He sat on the floor and started reading. The entries were dated, scattered across years. Buddy had been documenting something. Encounters. Descriptions. Names. He described a family. Not human. Not animal. He never used the word Bigfoot, but the sketches were undeniable. Towering figures. Broad shoulders. Hair-covered bodies with long arms and flat, expressive faces. He called them the quiet ones, or sometimes the watchers. They never spoke, never entered the cabin. But they came to the porch. They shared food. They stayed close when Bernard's grief was too heavy to carry alone. He called them his second family. And then Bill saw it, a sketch of one of them, smaller, leaner, with sharper features. A teenage male, perhaps. Beneath it, a single sentence. "The boy is different. The boy doesn't like my grandson." Bill dropped the page. He remembered the times his father had cried when they packed for the cabin, how Daniel always seemed distant when Buddy brought up the woods, how he flinched at thunder. At the sound of water lapping wood, Buddy had written about the boy's jealousy. The way he watched Daniel from the trees, the accidents that followed, stones thrown, trips near the water. One time, Daniel almost drowned. Buddy had pulled him out just in time, but he never wrote down how the boy's hand had been on Daniel's ankle, dragging him down. Bill began to shake. This wasn't just legend. This was legacy. And that night, the cabin shook again. Footsteps around the outside, and something at the window. Tall, broad breath fogging the glass. Dave cursed, grabbed the rifle. Bill froze. It was him. The boy, not a boy anymore. He was still alive, still angry, still waiting. Bill opened the drawer again, flipped through the papers. Names Buddy had written down. And one name was circled over and over. The father's name. It hit Bill like thunder. Maybe they could be reached. He ran to the back window, threw it open, and shouted the name into the trees. Then again, silence. Then everything stopped. The air. The footsteps. Even the generator kicked back on like nothing had happened. Dave looked at him. "What did you just do?" "I don't know," Bill whispered. "But I think someone heard me. And for the first time since I'd arrived, the cabin felt empty, too empty. But they both knew nothing in those woods ever really left. The air was thick the next morning. Not with fog, not even with heat, but with a pressure that settled on Bill's shoulders like something watching. Something waiting. He hadn't slept. Neither had Dave. They moved through the cabin like ghosts, avoiding the windows, keeping their voices low. That name Bill had shouted, Benaiah, the one his grandfather had written over and done something. It had bought them a silence, but not peace. As they sat at the breakfast table, sipping coffee gone lukewarm, Bill laid out the stack of papers between them, like some ancient relic unearthed from under stone. Dave didn't speak. He just stared at the drawings, the notes, the faces that shouldn't exist. Then he pointed to one sketch, the young male, the one with the hard jaw and slanted eyes, circled 3 times. "That's him," Dave said, voice flat. "That's who I saw by the window." They both knew they couldn't stay, not without answers. And the only place those answers lived was in the past. So Bill made a call, one he'd avoided for years. That afternoon, the floatplane returned, and Daniel stepped out, his face pale beneath his sunglasses. He hadn't been up to the cabin since the funeral. He didn't ask why Bill had called. He didn't have to. He saw the look in his son's eyes, the same haunted expression Buddy had carried home decades earlier. At first, Daniel refused to talk. He sat on the porch, arms crossed, staring at the tree line. But as dusk settled in and the first coyote howls echoed off the lake, something shifted. He stood, walked over to the generator, and shut it off. Then he lit a lantern and returned, eyes flicking to the woods behind them like he expected something to answer. "When I was a boy," he said, voice rough from disuse, "I drowned, or I showed the..." The story spilled out slowly, like a wound reopening. The summers he'd spent with Buddy, the strange family Buddy called his friends. The games they played, hide and seek between the trees, races down the trails. But one boy had always stood apart, the older one. Bigger, quieter, watching. "He hated me," Daniel whispered. "Didn't want me there, and one day, he almost made sure I didn't come back." Daniel had been swimming off the dock, showing off. He remembered his father standing on the porch, distracted by the fire pit. The water had been cool, peaceful. Then, without warning, something tugged at his legs, pulled him down, hard. Daniel kicked, screamed underwater, bubbles bursting from his nose. But the grip didn't loosen. It tightened, cold, strong fingers wrapped around his ankle, dragging him deeper, and then Daniel saw it. The boy, beneath the surface, eyes wide, hair floating like seaweed, face twisted with something that wasn't anger. It was hunger. He blacked out. When he came to, Buddy was holding him on the dock, coughing water, gasping for breath. His father never said a word, just rocked him back and forth like a baby. That night, they packed up and left. They didn't go back for years. And when they did, it was never the same. Bill sat in silence, listening. Every word slid into place like a puzzle he'd been trying to solve since childhood. All the discomfort, all the hesitation, his father's strange distance from the place. It all made sense now. The cabin had been a refuge, yes, but not from the world, from something deeper, from something buried. Daniel reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Old, brittle, the edges torn. He handed it to Bill, Your grandfather made me write their names once, he said. Said it helped him remember they were real. Said it helped keep the boy away. Bill opened it. 5 names, written in a child's shaky script. 3 of them were underlined. One was smudged, barely legible. Benaiah. That name again. I think he's still here, Bill said. Not as a question. Daniel nodded, slow and sure. He never left. As darkness rolled in again, the woods returned to stillness, but the kind that pressed against the windows like a held breath. They ate in silence. No fire. No generator. Just the hiss of the lantern and the groan of old wood beneath their feet. Hours passed. The 3 of them took turns staring out into the black. At one point, Dave muttered, "Do you feel like we're being watched?" But nobody answered, because they all knew. Then, just after midnight, a soft thud on the roof. Another. Then dragging. Something big, heavy, slow. They stayed still, breath caught in their throats. A shadow moved across the front window, blocking the moonlight for a second. Then silence again. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then a whisper, not words. Not a language, just breath and syllables that almost meant something. Daniel gripped Bill's arm so tightly it hurt. "That's them," he whispered. "That's how they talk when they want to be heard." The whisper came again, closer this time. It sounded like leaves brushing across a coffin. Dave reached for the rifle. Bill put a hand over it. "No," he said quietly. "Not tonight, because somewhere, deep inside." Bill understood. They weren't there to hurt them. Not yet. They were remembering. Testing. Trying to see if the child they'd known, the bloodline of Bernard Simmons, still belonged. The whisper faded. The shadows moved back. The woods inhaled again. And as the lantern flickered, Bill realized something else. They weren't the only ones remembering. The forest remembered too. And it was waiting to decide if it would forgive. The next morning began with birdsong. It should have been comforting, familiar. But after what Daniel had confessed the night before, every sound felt suspicious. Like it wasn't just nature waking up, but something mimicking it. The woods didn't echo birdsong quite right. The rhythm was always slightly off, too precise, too knowing. Bill stood by the edge of the dock with his coffee cooling in his hands, watching mist peel off the lake's surface in long, trembling strands. Behind him, the cabin stood quiet, and inside it, generations of stories lay pressed between wood and time. They decided not to leave, not yet. Something tethered them there, a strange sense of unfinished business, like the cabin itself had more to say. And so, they stayed. That afternoon, Daniel walked around the perimeter with deliberate steps, trailing his hand along the logs Buddy had chopped and fit himself. Dave kept his rifle close. Bill, meanwhile, went back into the kitchen, drawn to the drawer that had started it all. There was still more. More sketches, more notes, more truths his grandfather had left behind, like breadcrumbs in a forest far older than they'd ever known. He pulled out another stack, bound with a leather cord, brittle but intact. The top sheet was a crude map, drawn from memory, showing landmarks in the surrounding forest. Circles marked what looked like meeting spots, and symbols Bill couldn't quite understand. Small crosses, spirals, a star-like mark that repeated near water. And then there was the cabin itself, drawn as if from above. But beneath it, in thick black ink, a single word written in all caps. Hatch. There was no hatch. At least, not one Bill had ever seen. By late afternoon, all 3 of them were crawling around the cabin, searching. Beneath the stairs. Under the rugs. Behind the storage shelves. It was Dave who finally found it. A hollow spot, behind the wood stove. A section of floor that didn't creak like the rest. When they pried it open, dust bloomed in the air. And a smell, damp, sour, metallic, hit their noses hard. There was a ladder, wooden and worn, leading down into a crawl space none of them knew existed. Bill went first. It wasn't deep, just 6 feet or so, but it stretched wide under the cabin, enough to stand hunched. The light from his flashlight cut through the dark, revealing dirt walls and a floor littered with old crates, rusted cans, and something else. Fur, not from an animal, from clothing. Human-made, a thick pelt coat hung from a nail driven into the support beam. Next to it, another sketchbook. This one smaller, filled with quick entries in shorthand. Bill flipped through it, heart hammering. Notes on behavior. Gestures, body language, reactions to fire, to light, to human speech. Then, images, photorealistic drawings of faces, some kind, others hard, angry. But the most detailed one, Bill recognized. The boy. Those deep, dead eyes. Benaiah, Bill whispered. Above him, he could hear creaking, Daniel pacing. Dave calling his name. But he kept reading. One page was different. The handwriting slanted, shaky, emotional. He taught them names. It read, "But they gave me theirs." And when I said Daniel's name, the boy turned. Then, he doesn't understand love. He understands place, position, territory. He thinks Daniel is stealing something. A place, a father. Bill put the journal down. Suddenly, it wasn't just about encounters. It was about inheritance. The boy, Benaiah, saw Daniel not just as a visitor, but as a rival. And when Bernard brought his son to the cabin, Benaiah saw it as a betrayal. From that moment on, something inside him turned cold. Back above ground, Daniel and Dave were arguing quietly. Bill emerged covered in dirt, holding the notebook. "He never forgave us," Bill said. He thought Dad replaced him. Daniel looked at him, eyes narrow. "Who?" Bill hesitated. "Benaiah. That was his name." Daniel went still. The name hit him like a cold wind. He looked toward the woods, as if expecting to see something watching. "He was a child," Daniel muttered. "Just a child?" "No," Bill said. "Not anymore." That night, the tension was thicker than ever. They took shifts sleeping, if you could call it that. At one point, Dave swore he saw movement down by the shoreline. Something tall, hunched, swaying as it stepped out of the water. But when they ran out with flashlights, there was nothing but ripples and wet prints too wide to belong to any man. Just before dawn, the wind changed, brought with it a low moan, like wind through a hollow log, but deeper. Human, but not quite. It circled the cabin once, twice, then stopped, and silence followed, but it was the kind of silence that filled the lungs like water. Bill lay awake on the floor beside the old trapdoor, notebook open on his chest, and knew whatever line had once separated their world from theirs, it was gone now. The forest no longer watched from a distance. It had stepped inside, and it remembered everything. The morning fog hadn't lifted by the time they packed the journals into a dry bag and paddled across the lake. Bill didn't say much. Neither did his father. Dave paddled silently, eyes locked on the dense shoreline, as if expecting something to breach the water. The float plane wasn't due for another week, but they had enough fuel to get to the ranger station out east. And from there, a car, a bar, a place with signal, a place with people. But halfway across the water, Bill stopped paddling and turned to Daniel. "There's someone I need to talk to first." The tiny town of Weller's Creek lay about 20 miles south of the cabin, tucked between overgrown timber roads and the forgotten spine of the Cascades. It was mostly trailers, one general store, a post office that doubled as a bait shop, and a bar with antlers for a chandelier. But there was also Martha Whitlow. 86, born and raised nearby, with a mind sharper than the hunting knives in her kitchen drawer. Bill remembered her from when he was a kid. She used to sit on the porch of the store in a rocking chair, chewing tobacco and spitting wisdom. They found her in the back of her home, surrounded by shelves of books, maps, and bundled newspapers tied in twine. Her hair had thinned to wisps of silver, but her eyes lit up when she saw the Simmons boys. "Well, if it ain't the ghosts of Bernard and Daniel," she said, pulling them into a musty hug. Bill wasted no time. He laid out the sketches, the journal, the name, Benia. Her expression darkened, just slightly. Not shock, recognition. "Your granddaddy wasn't the only one who saw them," she said. "But he's the only one who tried to live among them." She called them the rude people, or in the old Salish tongue, Talton. Those who dwell beneath. Not Bigfoot, she was quick to clarify. The old legends, they don't describe no monster. They describe watchers, teachers, but not all of them are kind. She told them of stories passed down long before settlers arrived, how certain clans believed the forest had guardians who chose which humans could stay. Those who were welcome found food, warmth, even healing in the wild. But those who overstepped disappeared. Sometimes the line wasn't clear. One story told of a logger's son who played too rough, who mocked the old rituals. The boy vanished during a storm and was never seen again. Another story spoke of a family who tried to build a home too close to the water, and their baby was taken by the grieving mother. Then she said it quietly, like a prayer. "They live like we used to, before we forgot how to belong to the land. But sometimes they want something back." She leaned forward, her voice lowering. "Benaiah," she repeated. "That's a name I haven't heard in over 40 years. My uncle used to swear there was one who didn't act like the others. Mean, territorial. Said he was raised wrong, or not raised at all. Banished from the deeper woods." Bill felt the hairs on his arms rise. Everything his grandfather had written was mirrored in this woman's memory. She flipped through the sketchbook, stopping at a drawing of the older male. "That's him," she said, tapping her crooked nail on the page. "That's the one who tried to take my cousin Clara when we were girls." Daniel stiffened. "He attacked someone." "Not quite," she said. "He invited her. That's what made it worse. He wanted her to choose to leave, to go with him. When she didn't, he tore apart their smokehouse. Back in the cabin, Buddy must have known. He had studied them, named them, but he never told anyone how far it went." Bill asked about the symbols on the map. Martha nodded. "Boundary markers, sacred ones. Old tribes used to leave stones stacked a certain way. If you see them moved, you leave. No questions." Bill remembered the spot behind the cabin. The stones they cleared to dump the carcasses. They must have been part of that. A warning or a seal. As they stood to leave, Martha grabbed Bill's wrist. Her voice was serious now. "If you go back, don't speak his name again. Names are powerful. If you call him, he'll come. And next time, he won't just watch." They drove back in silence. No one slept that night. But sleep didn't matter anymore. The forest had a story. They'd only heard the beginning. The cabin wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was marked by something older, a memory still alive. And the deeper they looked, the more they realized. They weren't just being watched. They were being judged. The cabin burned sometime in the night. When Bill and Dave returned weeks later, all that remained were blackened timbers, melted aluminum, and the rusted spine of the old wood stove curling like the ribs of something dead. The air still smelled like smoke, sour and ancient. Daniel stood behind them, mouth tight, hands in the pockets of his windbreaker, eyes fixed on what had once been a home, a sanctuary, and, possibly, a door. At first they all believed it was lightning, a freak summer storm, but the trees around the clearing stood untouched. The fire had started inside. It had wanted the cabin, and only the cabin. They didn't speak much that day. They sifted through the wreckage in silence, Bill picking out warped scraps of metal, the handle of a coffee pot, the burnt remains of one of Buddy's sketches. The journal was gone. All of it turned to ash. And just when it seemed like the past might have been buried for good, a news story surfaced. A teenage boy had gone missing near Timberlake Ridge, not 40 miles south of the cabin. Disappeared without a trace during a family camping trip. The father had stepped away to fetch water. When he returned, the boy was gone. No footprints. No struggle. Just gone. Rangers searched for 3 days. Dogs picked up a scent that led straight into the forest and then stopped like it had been swallowed. Bill sat in the back of his truck, reading the article on his phone, heart pounding. The boy's name was Eli, 17. Brown hair, athletic, vanished just before dawn. It was the just before dawn part that stuck. That was when the whispers always came. And then he saw it, in the bottom paragraph of the article. The kind you almost skip over. A quote from the search party leader. "We found a ring of stacked stones about a mile off the main trail. Looked old. Real old. Nobody touched it." Bill dropped the phone. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't over. They went back to Weller's Creek. Martha Whitlow was waiting on the porch like she knew they'd return. When they told her about the boy, she didn't even flinch. "They don't just watch anymore," she said. "They're hungry for something." Daniel paced the gravel driveway. "What do they want?" he asked. "We didn't take anything. We didn't violate anything." Martha stared into him. "No, but you replaced someone, and you left the door open." In the days that followed, Bill fell into a rabbit hole. Newspaper clippings. Forest ranger notes. Online forums with cryptic stories from other states. Montana, Oregon, parts of Alaska. Stories that shared eerie details. Strange smells. Structures found in the woods. People vanishing near rings of stones, or old cabins built without blueprints. They found one case, Port Chatham, Alaska, where the entire town had evacuated in the 1950s, claiming shadowy figures were stalking the hills. Whole families left homes, boats, everything behind. Never came back. The locals called them Nantiinaq, the Silent Ones. Another report from 2002 described hikers in Washington state who discovered claw marks 15 feet up a tree, spaced like fingers. One claimed to hear singing at night, low and rhythmic, like lullabies in a language nobody should know. And always, there was a child who disappeared, or returned different. Daniel finally broke one night, flipping through pages Bill had printed and pinned across the cabin wall of their rental house. "We need to stop this," he said. "We need to stop feeding it." But it was too late, because the fire hadn't been the end. It had been the signal. That summer, 3 more people went missing in counties bordering the forest. A hunter, a camper, a girl hiking solo. Each time, the same pattern, the same silence, the same emptiness. And Bill started having dreams again, standing on the porch of the cabin, looking out at the tree line, only to see eyes open between the branches. Not glowing, not animal, just watching. One night he woke to find muddy footprints on his porch, human-sized. But spread too far apart. Daniel wanted to leave, move south, sell the land, but Bill refused. "We don't run," he said. "Not from our own blood." He meant it literally, because somewhere in those woods, the legacy Buddy had tried to keep sacred was unraveling. And whatever had once accepted them as kin, now remembered betrayal. Bill understood now. Bill understood now. This wasn't about belief. It wasn't about monsters or myths. It was about inheritance, and something old was making sure the debt Buddy left behind would finally be paid. For weeks, Bill kept quiet. Not out of fear. Not exactly. It was the kind of silence born of pressure. When something grows inside you and words can't hold the weight. He stopped talking to Dave. He let his dad drift back to his quiet apartment 2 towns over. The search parties in Timberlake Ridge ended. No new leads. No suspects. And yet, more people stopped going into the woods. The stories spread like brush fire. Local blogs, strange Reddit threads, whispered barstool theories. Everyone had an idea, but none of it fit the truth Bill now carried. He sat one evening with the last photo he had of the cabin, before it burned. Buddy standing on the porch, hand on Daniel's shoulder, both of them squinting into the sun, both pretending to belong to the same world. But now Bill saw it for what it was. Borrowed time. He needed answers. Not stories. Not speculation. So he started putting together everything. His grandfather's writings, the notes Martha had given them, historical records, native lore. He drew a line from folklore to anthropology to something stranger still. Something that lingered between myth and blood. Bigfoot wasn't the word. Not anymore. That name was a cartoon, a sideshow. But the beings Buddy described, especially the family, fit too closely with other older reports to dismiss. The Alaskan Nantiinak, the Pacific Northwest's Skookum, the Inyuknun of the high plateaus, even the Algonquin Wendigo, though far more distorted and monstrous in legend, shared thematic roots, solitary, forest-dwelling entities shaped by hunger, grief, and exile. But what set Buddy's story apart was that I'd never treated them as myths. He'd lived beside them, shared food, shared grief. And maybe that's what had bound them together in the first place. Bill searched further into psychology, sociology, even neurobiology. What if grief had made Buddy see things? What if isolation had fractured his mind? But no, that didn't explain what Bill had seen, or the dreams, or the smell, or the footprints that showed up on his porch in the middle of the night. And then he found it, a local newspaper from 1958, a single paragraph about a missing hunter near Mirror Hollow. It described a feral man, naked, covered in hair, seen briefly by a group of hikers before vanishing into the trees. But the part that chilled Bill was the description. Taller than average, with a sloped forehead, elongated arms, and eyes that looked mournful. The article ended with a name. Benaiah. It wasn't possible. But there it was, a name not mentioned by Martha, not known outside his grandfather's notes. Which meant someone had encountered him before Buddy, before Daniel, maybe even before the cabin was ever built. That night, Bill drove out to Mirror Hollow. He parked at the edge of the old logging road, hiked in without a flashlight. The trees felt closer here, tighter, as if the woods themselves had turned inward, bracing. He reached the edge of the ridge just as the wind died. There were no sounds, no bugs, just trees swaying without creaking, and a distant smell, like wet stone and old fur. He waited. Hours passed, and then, just as he began to think nothing would happen, he heard it. A single low exhale, like a sigh through a throat too wide. Not behind him, not beside him, below. He stepped closer to the ridge, looked down, and in the dark, just past the tree line, two eyes blinked, not glowing. Just there, watching. Bill didn't run. He didn't move. He just whispered, "I'm not him. I'm not Daniel." A pause. Then the trees moved. Slow. As if something massive had turned its body to leave. The eyes vanished, and just like that, the wind returned. The next day, Bill went to see Daniel. He told him everything. What he'd seen, what he suspected. That Benaiah wasn't just alive. He was still watching, still mourning, but not just for what had been taken, for what had been broken. Daniel didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, he said, "Maybe he just wanted to be loved." Bill nodded. "And maybe we made him into a monster." Daniel stared out the window. "We didn't make him anything. We just forgot how to listen." That night, Bill dreamed of the forest again. But this time he wasn't on the porch. He was sitting at a fire, like his grandfather described. Across from him sat a figure. Not quite man, not quite beast, just presence. It didn't move. It didn't speak. But Bill felt something pass between them. Grief, recognition, forgiveness. When he woke, the wind outside was howling. Not with violence, with memory. And Bill understood then what his grandfather had tried to say all those years ago. Some stories don't need an ending. They need a witness. They didn't rebuild the cabin. Not because they couldn't. Bill had the means, the tools, the land. It was a decision that came like breath on cold glass. Quiet, natural, inevitable. Some places are meant to return to earth, to rot, to be reclaimed by the forest that bore witness long before any man came knocking. That summer, he and Daniel took one last trip. No fishing poles, no generators. Just a single tent, 2 packs, and the last of Buddy's ashes. They paddled the same way Buddy and Ben had done decades earlier. Bill in front, Daniel in back. The lake was mirror slick, the morning air heavy with the scent of pine and wet soil. No one spoke. There was nothing left to explain. They reached the spot by mid-morning. The fire pit was gone now, swallowed by grass, the porch stones blackened but still standing. The cabin itself nothing more than a charred imprint, like a memory burned into the floor of the forest. Daniel didn't step onto the foundation. Instead, he circled wide and knelt beside the base of an old cedar. Bill opened the urn, letting the ash catch wind and fall like snow through the light. They didn't cry. Buddy was already part of this place. And maybe so was Benai. The days that followed were quiet, but not empty. They walked the ridge, marked the stones. Bill recited the names he'd read so many years ago, not as a call, but as a farewell. Something answered, not in shadow, but in stillness. It was as if the woods had listened, had weighed their hearts, had chosen to let them go. And just before they left, while packing camp, Bill found a small bundle resting at the base of the cedar, a cluster of fresh berries neatly wrapped in braided grass, still warm from the sun. It hadn't been there the night before. That night back in town, Bill couldn't sleep. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was hollow, roomy, like something had shifted in the soil of his bones. He poured a drink, sat on the porch, and then he thought of Eli, the boy from Timberlake Ridge, still missing, still echoing through the trees like a name half said. Bill couldn't help but wonder if he'd been taken or chosen. Daniel joined him a few minutes later, sitting with a sigh that sounded older than his years. They didn't speak for a long time. Just listened to the wind move through leaves that felt 1,000 voices deep. Eventually, Daniel said, "You think they're still watching?" Bill nodded once. "I think they never stopped." Another pause. Then softer, "You think they ever forgave us?" Bill looked out across the dark, toward the line where woods met stars. "I don't think forgiveness is the point." Silence again, but this time it didn't scare him. The forest will always hold secrets. Some of them move on 2 legs. Some of them leave tracks. Some just wait. But the worst ones, the ones that haunt forever, are the questions we'll never get to ask. And maybe that's why we go back, not to find answers, but to leave something behind, and hope the trees remember us kindly. Sometimes what haunts us isn't the thing in the woods. It's the silence we inherit, the spaces between memories, the truths passed down in whispers and half-remembered dreams. Across time, families carry the weight of what they choose to forget, and the quiet burden of what they choose to remember. There are places in this world where the line between real and unreal thins like morning mist, where the old stories breathe through the trees, not to frighten us, but to remind us of the parts of ourselves we've buried. In those places, mystery isn't the enemy. It's the invitation to listen deeper, to feel more, to remember that the world is older than our names for it. The unknown, what some might call the monstrous, has never truly been about fear. It's about recognition, the reflection of our own loneliness, our longing, our capacity to love something we don't understand. When we demonize the unknown, we lose not just the story, but the lesson. That sometimes, the things we fear most are simply asking to be seen, acknowledged, even forgiven. Because in the end, the greatest horror isn't what hides in the forest. It's the way we forget to see each other. And maybe that's what all legends are. Attempts to fill the silence left behind by those who couldn't tell their stories. A bridge between the living and the lost. A soft knock on the door of our collective memory. Asking to be let in, not to harm, but to heal. Thank you for walking this path with us, for sitting by the fire a little longer, for listening. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of a place, a person, a question you've long carried, share it. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We read everyone, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing and following our channel. There are more stories like this waiting to be told. Stories that deserve to be heard, not just for what they reveal, but for how they make us feel. Until next time, may the quiet guide you, and may the woods remember you kindly.